bonded, as only men who placed their lives in the hands of others can understand. As his turn came, the rookie powered up his Hurricane, and he lifted her gently into the sky. It is so important that we understand this young man's story. He was there by choice, and choice is a magnificent standard up to a point. Choice is the gift of freedom, and men have made it clear that they desire freedom and that they're willing to die for it. But the freedom that they want is not from unconstrained choice, but rather it's the opportunity to express themselves, to enrich themselves, and to govern themselves in a world that is already defined by an intuitively understood set of natural commitments. In an earlier time, those natural commitments were called nature's law or God's law. In America, we enshrine those natural rights in what we call our Bill of Rights. We express our love for those rights in our commitments to how we serve. Our service affirms that those natural commitments are valued and protected in our orderly American society. What young Fisk was fighting for in the skies over England was political liberty, the greatest gift that people can earn for themselves, a gift which is threatened when social order is threatened, and social order is protected by law enforcement, the fire service, and the military. Billy Fisk understood that he was what he was flying for, and so did his fellow pilots. So do our young men and women out fighting today. We're fighting to maintain commitments that have taken generations to form that can be lost in less than a year. Freedom, political freedom, religious freedom would be lost if those German socialists and those of lesser character who would gladly trade stability for freedom, security for liberty, would have their way. And it was even more significant for Billy Fisk. You see, he was born the son of privilege and wealth in Chicago. He was educated in some of the finest schools in the world. He was a two-time Olympic champion. He understood what Hitler and his National Socialist government was trying to destroy: individual freedom. The Battle of Britain was also not the first time Billy had stood up to Hitler and socialism. When asked to be the captain of the U.S. bobsled team in 1936, he declined, saying that he would not perform in front of Hitler nor be the guest in Hitler's Germany. Billy knew that back home there were some people who were calling him a traitor. Back home in Chicago, they were calling for his arrest for his violation of the Defiance Act of 1935. It was called the Neutrality Act. It forbade Americans from even traveling to war-torn areas, more or less participating in the fighting. But none of that mattered for Fisk. Values drove him. His respect for freedom. He understood that there are things that men are willing to fight and die for. Freedom of speech, freedom from fear, freedom of religion, and freedom of association. That's what we're celebrating by those banners hanging behind me tonight. Our association as brothers and sisters in the fire service. Billy was fighting with our friends in the British a year before America even joined the war, at the risk of his own freedom, at the risk of his citizenship, at the risk of his own life. And so 27 days later and 42 sorties, we find young Billy Fisk preparing for his third sortie of the day. Having survived for 28 days, almost 4 weeks, he was one of the old salts. He went from being called Yank to lieutenant to now the old man. It was kind of funny because at 28 he felt old. 10 minutes into his flight, while cruising at 20,000 feet, he saw them. 400 Hinkle bombers and a swarm of fighters headed straight for him. He switched his guns from safe to fire, started dropping out the sky with his Hurricane engine screaming. A Hinkle 111 bomber came into his view. Around him, the sky was filling with smoke, parachutes, greasy fireballs, and pieces of metal. The radio was full of urgent voices, some smooth and some panicked. Closing in on his target, he moved his finger over his fire button. The fighter roared into the German bomber, and he fired a short burst. The Hurricane shook as 200 .303 rounds flew into the side of the bomber. The Hinkle dipped, rolled abruptly, just before its right wing snapped off. That's when he saw the tracers shooting by his cockpit. angry little yellow bits of light. Instinctively, he jerked back on the stick to pull the Hurricane's nose into the air, and in his cockpit erupted in fire. He knew his plane was on fire, but only the cockpit. He was burning alive. He could feel his hands losing their grip on the stick. He knew that he should bail out, but he also knew that the British needed every plane, and if he ejected, that would be one less Hurricane in the fight. And so 12 miles from RAF landing field Biggins, he decided to bring the crippled bird home. Slipping in and out of consciousness, he guided the wounded aircraft, now dead stick with its engines quit, to a landing at Biggins. Slamming hard into the field, Billy's fuel tank exploded, and the entire cockpit again erupted in fire. The horrified ground crew pulled Billy burning from his own airplane. 2 days later, Billy Fisk, two-time Olympic bobsled champion, movie maker, the man who founded the Aspen Ski Lodge, millionaire who could have easily avoided service and warfare altogether, became the first American to die in World War II. On a cold and rainy August 20th, the members of Billy's millionaire squadron carried his coffin to its final resting place, draped by the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack. This brave young American aviator was one of 7 brave Americans who fought the Battle of Britain. The honor guard stood tall and proud, and taps were quietly played on the hill. Over the coffin stood his mother and dad, racked by the loss of their only son, yet uniquely proud of his devotion to duty. Emotionally devastated, but proud of his response to service. Proud that their son, raised in privilege, who could have avoided duty altogether, chose, volunteered for the actions that would eventually claim his life. This is loyalty to values. This is selfless service. This is who you are. This is why you were called. This is why you joined. This is what you do as firefighters. You protect society. You exemplify good choices. You provide examples of loyalty and service. By your work, you honor men of character like Billy Fisk, who are willing, like you, to put their lives at risk for others, who are dedicated, like you, to the service of their communities. The mission of the fire service is critical not only to our local communities, but to our nation, as critical as our military, our law enforcement, and our police officers. And the importance of having a well-trained and well-disciplined fire service cannot be understated. As such, you all have a tremendous responsibility and a tremendous burden, not only to the citizens to whom you've sworn to protect, but to one another. Today, many would have you believe that great men like Billy Fisk are no longer among us. But in a few moments, we're going to hear the stories of great men and women, so now we know that that is a lie. There are those among you who would like you to believe that America's best days are behind her. But by the stories we're going to hear in a few moments, we can prove that that is a lie. And then there are those among us who would have you believe that values and character no longer matter, but that is the greatest lie of all. The Hagerstown Fire Department proves that every day. And by your presence here today as firefighters, you prove it immensely. Let me share another quick story with you. As the dust settled on September 11, 2001, weary firefighters were stunned and confused while searching among the rubble for any sign of survivors. Among those searching was a former NYPD police officer, now an FDNY firefighter named Chris Engeldrum. Chris also served in active duty during Operation Desert Storm as a paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne. On that tragic September day, with his fellow surviving firefighters from his company ladder 161 in the Bronx, he was searching among the rubble for his fallen brothers, and it was becoming more and more apparent by every passing moment that no one survived. Chris was searching with his fellow crew members from 61 when they found an American flag lying on the ground. Chris called out to Captain Dugan, "Where can we raise this flag?" Dugan grabbed a nearby ground ladder, threw it up against a light post that had survived and was standing in the rubble, and with Chris Engeldrum bucking that ladder, they raised that flag. This is not the iconic flag photo that you've all seen taken much later in the day. This was a flag that was raised moments after the collapse, while the dust was still heavy in the air, while the wounded were still looking for treatment, and the survivors were still struggling to rescue anyone they could. This was the first flag raised over Ground Zero, A flag that was raised during the fog of war in defiance of those who would try to hurt us. Raised instinctively, raised courageously by firefighters, by men of character. Several weeks after 9/11, Chris would learn that members of his old unit, the 27th Brigade, were going to backfill in the legendary 69th New York Irish Brigade for duty in Iraq. Chris couldn't let his old teammates go without him, so he re-enlisted in the United States Army with the fighting 69th. Chris re-enlisted because of a sense of loyalty, a sense of duty, a sense of honor, a calling to service. Chris re-enlisted because men like him, people like you, are always true to their inner character. On a miserably hot November 29th, the armored Humvee, carrying Chris and Specialist Wilford Orbana, also a firefighter in civilian life, and another FDNY firefighter, Daniel Swift of Ladder 43, and 3 other soldiers, was hit by an IED. Chris and Wilford, both firefighters, both soldiers, both men of character, both men of impeccable integrity, were killed. Chris was there because he could not let his comrades go fight without him. The same loyalty is expected. No, it is demanded from each and every one of you. The same integrity is expected from each and every one of you. The same kind of integrity that Billy and Chris exemplified by their devotion to our values. Chris Engeldrum became the first member of the fighting 69th to die in Iraq. Chris Engeldrum was the first member of the FDNY to die in active military duty following 9/11. Brothers and sisters, friends and family, now as never before, America needs good role models. Now as never before, she needs her great firefighters like you gathered here today, men and women who are willing to be dedicated and true to their values and our principles. The philosopher Albert Pike once said, "What we have done for ourselves alone dies with us. What we have done for others and the world remains and is immortal." You see, we'll get the opportunity to do many things in life that matter. But nothing is going to matter as that which you do for others. You've chosen to be part of a group of individuals with the same moral integrity as Billy Fisk and Chris Engeldrum, known as the Brigands. And that's not a name that was given to us lightly or casually. It was earned by the sacrifice of thousands of firefighters over hundreds of years who were willing to put everything at risk because it's what we swore to do. Men and women who are willing to put their lives on the line because they know that there are some things more important than our own personal safety. Euripides said that the bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what lies before them, the glory and danger alike, and notwithstanding, go out and meet it. One last short story. You see, heroics doesn't skip generations. It's part of American culture. Selflessness does not come and go in a society. In America, it is perpetuated. And loyalty is not taught in books. It's learned from example. It was November '65 in the hot, sticky, infested jungle of the Drang Valley, and a group of Army 7 Cav were on early patrol one morning. Suddenly a burst of gunfire rang out and the point man went down, wounded severely, and he began to call out for help. The other soldiers instinctively jumped behind the berm as bullets all around them started to fall with deadly accuracy. The wounded point man began calling out, crying out in terror and pain, asking for help, pleading for someone to please come join him. After several agonizing moments, one of the soldiers threw off his robe, grabbed his M16, and started over the berm. The other soldiers pulled him back in by his ankles. "It's a trap!" They screamed at him. "It's a trap, and if you go out there, all you'll do is get yourself killed. He's already dead, and there's nothing you can do for him. He's gone already." The point man continued to cry out, again calling for help. Behind the berm, he could stand it no longer. The soldier grabbed his rifle, left from behind the safety of the berm, and began to zigzag under horrific fire. The soldiers behind the berm tried to lay down suppressive fire, but the enemy had them pinned down in a hail of gunfire that continued to rain down with the 2 men now out in the open. As the gunfire continued relentlessly, at the top of the berm appeared the soldier carrying the now dead point back to the security of the berm. The rescuing soldier was also fatally wounded himself. And as he lied there bleeding to death, his fellow soldiers asked him why. Why would you go out there knowing the